Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar looking at what we can learn from the just recently launched BrandZ report, Top 100 Most Valuable Chinese Brands in 2020. My name is Chris Lethbridge. I'm delighted to welcome CBBC members to this exclusive consumer briefing with WPP's David Roth. David is the CEO of the store, EMA and Asia, as well as chairman of BrandZ. Looking back on this rather tumultuous year that has been 2020, I was struck by two kind of recent key facts that reinforce the importance of the Chinese market to both the global economy and the UK. And the first of these was a recent economic update from the Asian Development Bank, suggesting that China is on track to achieve growth of 2.1% this year and 7.7% in 2021. And the second of this is a recently released trade data from the UK government highlighting that UK exports to China grew at 10.7% this year, which was the second fastest economy in terms of exports, only behind Canada for 2020. So in light of these two facts, I think today's webinar is particularly timely as it once again reinforces the importance of both China and Chinese companies to the global economy. So just some brief housekeeping before we begin. David is going to present for us, and then we'll be followed by a moderated Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please put these in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris. I am just going to share my screen.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks very much indeed. So the way in which we're going to run this session is really in four very uneven quarters. The first is take a contextual view of the journey that Chinese consumers have taken from, I suppose, the liberalization of the Chinese consumption market many years ago to where we are today, because that journey really has a great impact in what we see for the trends of Chinese consumers, as reflected clearly in the BrandZ Top 100 Most Valuable Chinese Brands for this year. And probably more important to everybody on this call, the implications that has for how we should look and view the changes that the Chinese consumers will be undergoing in the course of the next few years, and the impact that will have clearly for all of our businesses. Then we'll run on to look at the top 100 most valuable Chinese brands, which is instructive in its own right. And then I'll talk about some of those implications, then on to Q&As. Now, rather than have death by PowerPoint in terms of going through all of this, we've pulled together, I suppose, two pieces of film. They'll run on back to back. First, looking at the contextual China consumer story, and then the countdown to the top 100 most valuable Chinese brands. And then once that's finished, we'll move on to looking at what the implications are from this year's study. So let me run those two films.
Only a generation or so ago, there were no Chinese consumers to speak of. At least not in the way we usually use the term consumer. People bought things, of course. They bought food and other essentials, clothes, bicycles, and they often aspired to buy more, wristwatches, sewing machines, but they generally bought what was available. They could choose which stall or store to buy from, and they could haggle about the price, but ultimately there was zero choice. Don't like the look of something? Don't buy it. But there's probably nothing else. Fast forward to today, and China is a consumer market like no other. the most remarkable transformation the world has ever seen. It's not just there are suddenly so many people with money to spend, or that almost overnight they have all the brands in the world to choose from. This is now the biggest retail market on the planet, but what makes it special is much, much bigger than the sheer scale of it. To understand Chinese consumers demands an appreciation of the pace at which China has moved and is moving as we speak. I call it China speed. 20 times the speed of any country on the globe. China speed has impacted every aspect of China's development. But put in the context of the change in Chinese consumers, China speed has seen virtually no cars at all to the biggest new car market in the world, with more than 300 million cars on Chinese roads. It's gone from near zero internet 20 years ago, just internet cafes packed with gamers, to a country of around 700 million avid internet users, almost all of them connecting with their mobile device. This leap from no phones to smartphones came at the same time as retailing went mostly from mum and pup shops to state-of-the-art modern stores. The simultaneous surge in technology and in payments, from no credit cards to an integrated, seamless digital payment platform that rivals the world and, of course, choice, has been rocket fuel for e-commerce, and rising wealth has been a powerful catalyst. Online shopping accounts for around a quarter of all retail sales now. The fact is all the more staggering when you consider that at least a third of the country's consumers have yet to get an internet connection. Put simply, once Chinese consumers go online, they go shopping. And that's why today over half of the world's e-commerce takes place in China. Consumers now have the money to spend, and they can get anything they want, fast, at China speed. Delivery within an hour is pretty standard in many places, within half an hour increasingly common. Super fast and efficient service is simply expected. But speed is just one of the ways in which shoppers' expectations have changed. When China started opening up in the 80s and 90s, consumers were in no doubt. They believed that goods from the West were definitely best. Even just 15 years ago, a Chinese-made option was something most people only bought as they couldn't afford the foreign alternative. And that wasn't without good reason. It used to be that Chinese factories with a license to export weren't allowed to make their goods for sale in China. So there were two tiers of quality, and the local option was often pretty shoddy. Foreign brands became shorthand for better, and in a highly image-conscious society became shorthand for I have arrived. But with typical China speed, the hunger for all things foreign and the willingness to pay a huge premium for it has been severely challenged. One reason is that now, made in China is actually pretty good, and often it's world-beating. Local businesses realised a while back that happy consumers were more valuable in the long term. They studied what the foreign brands were doing and wanted a share of that premium pricing. So they learnt from it. That meant producing better quality goods for starters. But they also began to appreciate the magic of marketing, of making an emotional connection as well as a sale. They understand the power of telling stories about innovation and provenance, workmanship and design. Chinese brands which previously had been copying or playing catch-up are now often leaders in their category. In many, they're credible, appealing alternatives to foreign brands. And as consumers moved from no choice to an abundance of choice, they quickly became incredibly discerning. equally comfortable in luxury boutiques, buying online or shopping in a wet market. No longer does a high price automatically signal better quality or higher desirability. And a foreign brand isn't seen as necessarily better. The days of dumping last season's stock on the China market and expecting shoppers to be grateful are long gone. In normal times, around 150 million Chinese tourists go abroad each year. They're sophisticated, savvy shoppers. And designing for Chinese consumers means much more than making it red and putting the year of the rabbit on it. Global brands must now design products in China for China, and they must do this not in the usual couple of years, but in months, at China speed, because this is what Chinese brands are doing now, and there's no shame in buying local anymore. In fact, there's real pride in the success of Chinese brands, especially those doing well abroad. So consumers are happy to choose made in China, and they'll even pay a premium if that's justified. But this is not just patriotism at work. Chinese consumers are buying Chinese brands with pride, not because those brands are local, but because these purchases make sense, and they make people feel good. So if you're an international brand wondering what all this means for your future in China, the task is clear. Be highly competitive on price and justify a premium. Be top of mind not just by bombarding people with advertising, but by telling people powerful brand stories, and by finding ways to make people's lives easier and better. And innovate. Do it fast, do it well, and do it specifically for China. Consumers' expectations of excellence have gone beyond products themselves. Nowadays, consumer service has to be spot on and, of course, fast. If people make a complaint to a business online, they expect it to be resolved within 5 minutes, not 5 working days. Watch out, any brand that lets its customers down, and that's easily done when expectations are so high. There are nearly 900 million social media users in China. Bad reviews travel fast, at China speed. But what makes a good experience for Chinese consumers today is not just the absence of something going wrong. The whole process of browsing, choosing and buying needs to be friction-free. It's now possible in China to pay with just a smile. Shopping also needs to be entertaining or informative. It must be fun or make life better in some other way. An amazing experience is simply expected, and consumers won't hang around for long if they don't find it. People want an experience that can be remembered and photographed and shared, of course. They want to feel special, like something's been done just for them. And in a country where there's still a strong sense of collectivism, people want to do things together, like turn shopping into a game, even when they're apart. Displaying status is no less important today than it was 20 years ago, back when Chanel and Louis Vuitton and a handful of others were all seen as interchangeable. Now there are new, more nuanced ways of attaining and expressing status. Being first in the know delivers instant kudos. The delight of discovery is increasingly important. So while millions used to covet the same collection of luxury items, it's personalization that's now far more important. Consumers don't want to be the same as everyone else. I used to say that Chinese consumers wanted to stand up, but not stand out. Today, they absolutely want to stand out, especially the young. They want to express themselves through music, video, how they look, what they do, and what they buy. What China speed has led to is a highly connected, highly demanding, and discerning consumer who often feels pulled in different directions at once, a kind of yin and yang tension that, in its powerful Chinese way, has its origins way back in China's rich history. Here are those yin and yang new forces that will be the defining characteristics of how Chinese consumers will grow and their demands change in the next phase of their rapid development. So, whilst there's growing concern about keeping healthy, especially now, there's also a yearning to indulge, to live for the moment. There's still badge value in having something luxurious, but also respect for getting great value for money. There's an appetite for acquiring more things, and yet a stronger sense that time and experiences are more important. There's excitement about what's fresh and new, an affection for things and brands that have been around for centuries. People want to be themselves, but also part of something bigger. They demand constant connectivity and retain strong connections with their past. With China speed, China's consumers have become sophisticated, proud, discerning, dynamic, and even in these times of a pandemic, incredibly optimistic. In the next 2 years alone, another 150 million people are set to join the ranks of China's middle classes. That'll add up to over 500 million people with disposable income. In other words, consumers. When China began its modern opening up to the world, Deng Xiaoping talked about socialism with Chinese characteristics. And today we might talk about a new kind of consumerism, one with Chinese characteristics. 10 years ago, WPP launched a ranking of the BrandZ top 50 most valuable Chinese brands. We quickly expanded it to 100. And what we've been able to do is to use it to chart and make sense of the astonishing transformation going on across China itself. When I launched the study a decade ago, the most valuable brand in China was China Mobile. Its performance reflected the importance of the fast-growing mobile phone market at the time, and the role of state-owned enterprises in China's economy. As technology became a bigger part of people's lives, and as local entrepreneurial brands became more significant to meet the needs of the China market, the entrepreneurial web giant Tencent overtook China Mobile as China's most valuable brand in 2015. Then, as connectivity and a thriving private sector fueled consumer change and growth, Alibaba became China's most valuable brand in 2019, with a value 3 times that of China Mobile a decade ago. The BrandZ China Top 100 has been the most dynamic of all the country BrandZ valuations now undertaken by WPP annually, some 21 countries. In fact, as a reflection of the change that we've seen in the Chinese economy and the Chinese consumers that we've just heard about in the previous film, just 5 brands that were in the top 10 when we launched the rankings 10 years ago are still there in the 2020 rankings, which we launched just a few weeks ago in Shanghai. Indeed, some technology-centric brands that are in the top 10 this year were barely founded 10 years ago. But this dynamism also includes another unique factor in the BrandZ China Top 100 compared to the other BrandZ value rankings across the world. In the China Top 100, we've not only got new and exciting young brands, but also brands that are literally centuries old. Brands that have recaptured their relevancy with the new Chinese consumer of today. Proof that enduring brands have an enduring life. But change hasn't just happened at the top. A decade ago, banks, telcos and insurance brands accounted for nearly 3/4 of the ranking's total value. In today's China, technology and retail brands dominate. In fact, they account for half of the total brand value in the BrandZ Top 50. As we've just seen in the film about the Chinese consumer, retail and technology have been driving disruptive change in China, in the economy and in people's lives. At the heart of success for China's fastest growing brands has been innovation. In the past year alone, the most innovative brands in the ranking have grown at 10 times the rate of the least innovative. Innovation strengthens competitiveness and drives brand and share price value. And while that's always important, whatever market you're in, it's absolutely vital in China, where what's new, if you don't remain relevant to the changing consumer, quickly becomes yesterday's news. Now, let me introduce the WPP BrandZ Top 100 Most Valuable Chinese Brands for 2020.
Well, I hope that's given you both a good overall helicopter view of the consumer journey, which clearly has impacted significantly the change in the top 50 as we started and top 100 most valuable Chinese brands. And given that we now have 10 years of history, 2020 was the 10th anniversary of the rankings, gives us a good viewpoint to make some interesting and insightful observations that can help both your understanding of the challenges in communicating and continuously to be relevant to Chinese consumers. So in this third quarter, we're going to look at some of those observations in a little bit more detail. As you saw from both of those films, there's been amazing change at the top in the across the ranking, but equally as reflected in the top 10. This is the situation, the position when we started, which was very much dominated by state-owned enterprises and financial institutions. This is the top 10 this year, dominated by technology players, consumer-centric brands, and brands that frankly weren't even in the top 50 when we started. But I think what's even more interesting is looking at, I suppose, the sector composition of the top 50 when we started in the top 50 in 2020 to be able to compare like with like. Now, when we started, the banks accounted for some 38% of the total value of the top 50. Today, banks only account for 12%. Technology only accounted for 9% when we started, is now at 26%. Lifestyle platforms didn't really exist then, around 4%. And I suppose the biggest change is very much the whole notion of the telecom providers, which very much dominated the infrastructure and the landscape at 21% of the value, now only accounted for 5% of the value. But really interesting as well is that there are a whole collection of other brands, so that goes in our sort of less than 5% as an individual brand, accounted for 20% of the total value. So a real change in the way in which the top brands in China in terms of their value, and that is of course completely reflective of consumer change in China and the way in which Chinese consumers are choosing to spend their disposable income in a very different way. We talked a little bit about technology. In fact, we talked a lot about technology because it has a massive impact. And again, when we started, there were 7 technology brands. Now there are 15 technology brands. And as you can see from that list, they cross all sorts of technological innovations, sectors, consumer usages. I mean, DJI didn't really exist when we started, now very powerful. And valuable Chinese brands, and clearly a very valuable and important brand on the world stage as well. Another way of being able to look at the change that we've seen and the importance that Chinese brands now have, not just in China, but also in the world stage, is this. We started, in fact, doing brand valuations of the top 100 most valuable global brands. After having done that, a lot of people ask questions, well, why can't you look at country brands, which is a very fair question. The first country we looked at was Chinese brands. But in 2006, which was the first study of the top 100 most valuable global brands, there was only one Chinese brand in the top 100, and that was China Mobile. And there were 28 European brands in the top 100. Fast forward to today, we launched the global top 100 just a couple of months ago in the height of pandemic lockdown, which was interesting in its own right. We see that there are now 17 Chinese brands in the global top 100, and only 18 European brands are still left in the ranking. So positive proof that not only have Chinese brands clearly grown in their significance and importance in China, but they've also grown in their significance and importance outside of China as well. Now, as I said in the film, the Chinese top 100 has been the most, I suppose, dynamic of all of the rankings that we've done across the world in terms of the number of dropout brands, in a sense. So this isn't a ranking where, once you get into it, you stay there for life. This is a very fast-moving ranking, which is reflective of the tremendous fast-paced change. I talked about 20x, maybe it's more than 20x than around the world, which obviously makes it very difficult from making sure you continuously remain relevant to a changing consumers. But as you can see, there are many brands that haven't done that, but equally there are many brands that have done that and have reaped the benefits from that as well. Now, you might have thought that in 2020, given the global pandemic and the impact that's had on China, clearly being first in, and as we've seen recently, it looks like very much first out. You might have thought that actually the overall value of the Chinese top 100 would have declined in 2020. In fact, it hasn't declined, it increased by 12% this year in a very, very complex and dynamic overall environment. We've seen the list in the countdown video. Amazing how long it takes you to count down from 100 to 1. I think one of the critical things that's worth reinforcing and talking a little bit about is this whole notion of, well, why bother to build brands? Why go to the time, trouble, effort, resource, both financial resource, people resource in order to do all of that? And I think this chart, I hope, gives the answer to that very clearly, which is those valuable, strong Chinese brands have significantly outperformed the stock market average, taken here as the MSCI. It's a weighted index of Chinese stocks, has significantly outperformed them in terms of shareholders' returns. So we absolutely do know, and we see this reflected in a lot of the other rankings across the world, including the top 100 most valuable global brands, that investing in creating a strong, valuable brand generates superior economic returns, as reflected in share price value. So investing in brands is exactly that. It's definitely an investment and definitely not a cost. Not only do brands outperform in the medium and long term, they also outperform in the short term as well. So we've looked at, I suppose, the height of the impact in terms of stock price performance in March in China, and then looked at those stock price performances in May, and we looked at the MSCI average, which was over that period an increase of 19%, and things started to recover. But if you look at our top 100 portfolio of all the brands, that increased over that period by 29%. And if we look at a slightly smaller bundle of that top 100, a subset of them, which have the greatest, what we call brand contribution, which is those brands that sales are much more driven by consumer preferences than things like sort of distribution. Those bundle of brands increased by 50%. Over the MSCI average. So again, some of the learnings that we're beginning to get out of looking at what happens over the, I suppose, the seismic shock, both to the global economy and clearly to national economies as well over that period. And we see this sort of pattern also reflected in other markets as well. We had 16 newcomers in the 2020 rankings. I told you it was dynamic. You never don't see anything like as that number in other rankings around the world. And as you can see from this list, it cuts across all sorts of sectors, from apparel through to retail and clearly technology, lifestyle platforms, and real estate as well. Nice to see Li Ning back in the top 100. They dropped out for a number of years. So it is possible if your brand does decline, lots of reasons for what happened with Li Ning. But if your brand does decline, it is possible to make a comeback. And these are the top 10 risers in 2020. Again, across all sorts of sectors. Interesting too, education brands in that New Oriental and VIP Kids, both very interesting businesses in their own right, but also beginning to see manifestations of how important continuing education was during the lockdown period, and also the importance of education generally. I'm sorry, in fact, there are 3 education brands in the top risers this year. Of course, COVID-19 has had an impact over and above, I suppose, the impact of other things. Clearly, a lot of these things are interrelated, but overall slowing economic growth in China anyway, aging population, and intensifying the China-US tensions, and also China-Indian tensions and China-UK tensions, all manifested in a sense from the tensions in US and China relationships. So let's take a quick sort of snapshot of some of the key observations through the lens of the top 100 and our analysis of that, that are reflective changes due to COVID, I suppose. I think the first thing is that we're seeing, and indeed we're seeing this around the world, but you would have thought maybe we wouldn't have seen that as much in China, given how technologically sophisticated consumption is in China. But we're even seeing in China faster consumer adoption of new technologies, especially by elder generations who weren't as digitally savvy and digitally familiar as the younger Chinese consumers have been. We are seeing that people are saying that as a result of COVID in China, there are some new attitudinal and behavioral changes that they have made. So, 67% of people are saying actually they intend to or are eating healthier, that their overall increased levels of hygiene, they're doing more online shopping, spending more time with people in their household. I suppose if you're locked in, that's pretty inevitable. High uses of social media apps, using online media more, focusing on personal development, as we saw the increase in education brands, value, trying new things, reading, etc., etc. All these trends are really important to get to grips with, because they are reflective of the way in which Chinese consumers are adapting, the way in which they spend their disposable income, and clearly that has an impact for all of us in terms of a redefinement, course correction maybe, of our current China strategy, but also providing a whole series of new opportunities for UK companies to engage, sorry, I seem to have lost connection here. So let me just see if I can get back. Hopefully we're back. We've heard a lot about the importance now of environmental responsibility in China. A lot of government policy, a lot of opportunities for UK businesses in this space. But here I think, hopefully you see now how relevant environmental responsibility in terms of product manufacture and usage, disposable of products, cradle to grave lifestyle cycle of products are in terms of Chinese consumers' mind now. So a massive amount of people, 75% of people, saying that actually environmentally friendly products and services as a result of their experience during the pandemic are much more important to them in terms of the way in which they purchase products as well. Again, you can see from this how there is a change in terms of what people are, I suppose, looking forward to once COVID-19 subsides, and obviously very much in China it has. So we are seeing already now people's spending changing, to travel again, going shopping both physically and especially digitally, going out to restaurants, etc. So we're beginning to see consumer change and the economy as well. I think a couple of things to point out is that one of the things that is a factor of Chinese e-commerce and has driven quite a lot of the brand values of some of the platform brands in China in 2020 is the growing importance of social commerce sales. It's not a factor that's grown, well, it's grown outside of China, but it's nothing like the growth rate of China. There are lots of factors for it, mainly because outside of China, the fluidity between a social and then being able to execute a commerce payment, doing it seamlessly, is not very possible. I think that will change, but at the moment, China is very much leading in that way. We spoke a little bit about this, the yin and yang of the Chinese consumer during the film, so as time is going on, I'll just whiz to, I think, 4 key insights for growing brands, but also understanding opportunities in a post-pandemic era. And it's very much an inflection point between, I suppose, the transformative decade of steady brand value growth and economic growth to, I think, what's very much going to become more apparent of what is a new more normal. So the first of those lessons is that premiumization really does drive value growth. And those brands that are operating in the premium space have grown their brand values over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, about 1.8 times those brands that are operating in the low premium state. And I think that's very important for us, for UK brands, to understand, because if you can command a price premium in China, then consumers are willing to pay for price premium products, and you can have very good growth rates. The question, of course, is what is it in terms of the Chinese consumers that allows you to command that price premium? Because as we saw from the film, in the early stages of the growth of consumerization in China, all you needed to do was to be a foreign brand, and that gave you permission to charge a price premium. That's not the case now. And the thing that drives the ability for brands to command a price premium in China is the whole notion of difference. Yeah. So just being aware of something, which is what we call in our terminology salience, is no good in terms of demanding a price premium. You have to create differential, and differential now is both in China is both a combination of physical product differentiation and also emotional differentiation. The story of where the product comes from. And again, the attributes that British products have, positive attributes in China by the notion of their heritage and some of the values of the UK as a country as seen in China. Also an important criteria for maintaining or communicating that differential and maintaining that differential. But product differentiation and the story around that product and how it's created and how it's produced and its efficacy is phenomenally important. The second lesson is that a superior brand experience also drives value growth. And it was fair to say, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago in China, that experience wasn't that important. In China speed, that's really, really changed, and brand experience is phenomenally important. Lesson number 3 is in this sort of new normal, don't forget the importance of the basics, and that is the purpose of what you do, your reputation, and how you build trust. And I think one of the interesting things in terms of purpose now is that in China, we're very much entering what I would call and define the sort of era of the public. And purpose in China is very much linked with the delivery of the China dream. I think it's very important to really understand that in the context of the China dream, in terms of understanding, in a sense, what your brand purpose could be. Now, it's very interesting to have a look at what does purpose in terms of corporate reputation do to you in terms of your growth. And what we have been able to see for the first time in China is that those brands that have strong corporate reputation as opposed to their individual brand reputation, this year have grown at a significantly faster, sorry, not this year, we looked at it from 2014 to 2020, at a significantly 90% faster rate than weak corporate reputation brands. So don't think that the corporate reputation is not important in China. It is as well. And then I suppose the fourth lesson and final lesson is that Chinese brands can be successful as both regional players in terms of brands. Let's not forget that a lot of Chinese brands, we might not see them in the UK on Oxford Street, we might not see them on Fifth Avenue in New York, but some of these brands are very strong regional players, maybe in Latin America and in other markets around the world, as well as being strong global brands. I also urge you to take a look at this, which is a study that we did in conjunction with Google, looking at the top 50 most valuable, biggest global Chinese brand builders. And here you can see a list of those 50 brands, very different in their context, I suppose, to the most valuable brands. And that report is well worth reading. As well as this, which is the BrandZ Top 100 Most Valuable Chinese Brands for 2020. The URL is at the top right-hand corner of the screen. Please do go there. There's a lot of other contextual, consumer-based information there. And do download the report because it's also full of a whole series of insights that I'm sure will help you both understand China better from the consumer perspective, but also understand where some new opportunities might lie for both you, your companies, and your brand. So I'll stop sharing now. We probably got a few more minutes left if there are any questions. I never have a problem with the questions, it's the answers I struggle with, but we'll see how we go.
Thanks for that, David. That was really interesting. And we can also share a link to the report in the follow-up email that goes out. So just a reminder, if everyone has questions, you can either use the Q&A box or raise your hand on the virtual hand button. We can unmute you so you can put your question directly to David. So we have actually received a question from Catherine in relation to actually kind of point 4 of the lessons, and that's around Chinese brands going global. And Catherine asks, so of the top 100 brands listed, how many have made moves outside China? Which markets do they tend to go to, and what point do they decide to expand overseas? And then as a kind of follow-up, is going overseas the ultimate aim? Or are they kind of happy to remain in China given the size of the market?
Okay, well, I'll start with the last question first, because that's a very good question. When you're looking at a market of 1.6 billion and still another 300 million, 400 million to become middle class, you might say, well, actually, let's concentrate on where the opportunity is. There are a few brands that have done that. But of course, the government in China is urging Chinese companies to become more global. That's sort of slowed down a little bit over the course of the last few months, but we see that they'll put their foot back on the accelerator of doing this. So I would say there's sort of 3 contextual types of organizations and how they look at it. The first is really interesting, and I do urge you to I'll give you the link for the China Brand Builders report, because there you see a whole series of interesting Chinese brands that we would not recognize. A lot of them in the technology, gaming sort of space that have decided from day one that they're going to be international brands. Anchor, I think, is a really good example of that. We probably all praise Anchor halfway through the day when we have to top up our charges on our iPhones. Well, I suppose at the moment, given we're all at home, probably not doing that as much as we used to. But pretty much 4 o'clock regularly every day, I'd get my Anchor charger out and give my iPhone some more juice. Anchor is a much bigger brand outside of China than it is inside of China. It recognized the fact that that space in China was very crowded, and they thought they had a good customer proposition. So the thing to do was to concentrate outside of China first. So there are a lot of companies that have taken that. There are then, I suppose, on the other extreme, I suppose more technology-driven brands, and then they're I suppose Haier is another really good example of a domestic appliance brand. It's the biggest domestic appliance brand in the world. It's making acquisitions outside of China, and has a very interesting management philosophy. Lorenz and Hei, if anybody's not heard a great deal about that, I'll also send you a link to a documentary around all of that, which is very interesting. But the road to success for Chinese brands outside of China is not a smooth one. Chinese brands struggle because they find it difficult to really understand that they might be a massive brand in China, but no one's ever heard of them outside of China. And also to the point of differentiation, the Chinese brands are not that great at being able to explain emotional-led differentiation outside of China, and the balance between emotional-led and product-led differentiation outside of China fares more in the more developed markets on the emotional side than the physical side. So I hope that sort of answers that question.
Very, very interesting. I mean, picking up on this international theme, Katie asks, how much of an impact will politics, i.e., Sino international relations, have on the Chinese domestic consumer and their purchasing behaviour?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question as well, because we're not seeing at the moment any strong backlash against specific countries' brands. I mean, it ebbs and flows. In China, these sort of anti-certain countries campaigns are whipped up fast, and they diminish, have a large impact, and then they diminish relatively quickly. We haven't seen, I would say, an increase in those at all, which I think is a good sign. But of course, Western brands inside of China do have to be very careful in what they say and how they behave, because social networks really do whip things up at a phenomenally fast pace. So it's something you have to be unbelievably mindful of. And of course, brands are not very good at playing in the political landscape. For a long period of time, and international brands have been very good at sort of sitting above sort of national, domestic, international politics. Brands over the course of the last 3 or 4 years have been dragged into having to take political stands, and that's a very complicated arena, and brands are only beginning to understand how best to play that.
Interesting. So I have a question around state-owned enterprises. So I think in 2011, the top 10 brands were dominated by state-owned enterprises. And I think, however, at the moment, less than half of them are state-owned enterprises. Are state-owned enterprises able to kind of respond to that challenge from private Chinese companies? And, are there things that Western brands or UK brands can actually learn from their response to these up-and-coming Chinese private companies?
Yes, I think what's been interesting about state-owned enterprises is they sort of now segment into state-owned enterprises that operate in monopoly areas. I mean, power is a good one, energy, petroleum markets. And then there are state enterprises that are operating now in a more sort of competitive arena. So dairy is a really good one. And those state-owned enterprises that are operating more consumer centric marketplaces where there's more competition have adapted. They first of all started to poach good people from FMCG companies, both on production, on marketing side, analytics. Now they've sort of been through that sort of wheel, and they've got their own good people to do all of that. So they've learned the hard way, and through understanding what Western brands do and how they behave, and have adapted the way in which they do that. So you can start to see, in this year's ranking. Well, of course, the last few years, some of those brands have really done well. I think state-owned enterprises still struggle to really understand and get their minds around the importance of understanding the emotional side to decision making and reflecting that within the way in which they operate and the way in which they communicate. So I think for a while, until their learning in that area increases, and it certainly has increased significantly, but I think we've got a fair way to go.
Yeah. I guess Moutai is quite an interesting case as well. I mean, but they've also got quite a lot of brand legacy that they can tap into as well.
Absolutely. And of course, some of that state-owned, and as you say, some of that state-owned heritage, is quite important in the story of the brand and the way in which, Maotai and Sensors is produced at every single big state occasion. It was the toast that Nixon gave to the Chinese when he was there was on Maotai. That instantly went around the world in seconds. So there are some intrinsic advantages that some of these state-owned brands have in the reach that they have, and I suppose now they're beginning to understand how to use that to marketing and storytelling advantage as well.
Well, David, that's unfortunately all the time we have today. I think it was a really fascinating insight into the Chinese brands and the way things are changing. Just going to quickly share my screen and highlight some upcoming events that CBBC is running. So on the 16th of December, we've got the launch of our Government Affairs Working Group in Beijing, for those of you who are joining from Beijing. On the 14th of January, we're looking at ByteDance and TikTok and its global success story. I did see them in the rankings.
Done exceptionally well.
Absolutely.
Fastest riser.
26th of Jan, we've got our business cultural training, and then the 4th of Feb, the China Scotland Business Awards, which will be an online event. But thank you everyone who was able to join, and thank you, David. That was
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Fascinating insights. And we'll share both some links to some of those videos and reports that you mentioned.
Tremendous. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks. Bye.